just don't think like farmers. It affects so many different things. I look at it just in terms of the way people thought 100 years ago. And I've used this example many times about my great-grandfather, whose farm was just about 3 miles away from this place. And I think about, I was probably maybe 10, I was probably 13, 14 when he passed away. But I was not thinking about agriculture at that time. And I've thought since, if I could go back and ask my great-grandfather questions, it would be interesting to know and see his perspective. And I've thought before, like for instance, if I'd have asked him, when do you plant corn? We think in terms of these constructs, a calendar, okay?
That's right where my mind just went.
Yeah, a calendar is a construct, okay? It's something that we utilize, and it's very helpful. I use them. I use plant charts that we developed and we put in the gardening manual and the homesteading manual. Plant, within this window in the calendar. We do this. Plant beans at this distance and this depth and all that. And so we think in terms of those constructs. But if I'd asked my grandfather, when you plant corn, he wouldn't have said, this date or in this window. He may have said something like what the term that the old timers use is, well, we plant corn when the oak leaves are the size of squirrel's ears. There is a completely different perspective. We're not taking that overlay, that construct, and applying it to the biological world. We're using the biological world, God's creation, to show us the patterns and to function within that. And our greatest impediment is what scrambled our brains, media technologies, the modern culture. How you function in that world is almost the opposite. It's an opposition to the way we function in God's creation and being able to see these things and seeing things from a perspective of wholeness. So that is what I see at the very beginning when we look at, okay, what are we going to do with this land? Okay, we have to look at it from the perspective of the whole. Okay, what are you trying, what is it that you are desiring? What do you feel that it is supposed to be? And you begin to look at, sustenance, we call it quality of life. What is it that you want to see happen on this land? That shapes our decisions. That determines. Many times it will determine things like some people, we call it their context, is not as conducive to raising animals. I think about different people that I've worked with before that say, well, I'm not sure that I could raise broilers because, processing chickens is a little bit difficult for me. That's something that people in our culture, harvesting of animals' death is something that is difficult for them. It's because that's not part of our culture. That was part of the everyday culture of people, that had animals and were on the land. And so, but there may be other things. Some people, like for instance, when my family was young and our children were small, we didn't have a milk cow. We had goats because a large animal would be difficult for 7, 8, 9-year-olds to handle, and it can be dangerous. And so we had goats. They were milk goats, and that was better for where we were at, for our context. As the children got bigger, as the boys got bigger, and we had a need for more milk, we got a milk cow. And so those things, what you want to see this land be, is going to shape your context. It goes back to a man from Australia called P.A. Yeomans, and he developed what's called the scale of permanence. And it's things like it starts with climate, then with land shapes or geography. I can't remember, I may have brought it with me. But it goes through these different things from what is more fixed or more permanent to things that we can change. And towards the bottom of the list is soil. We can change soil. We have difficulty changing the climate. We're going to have to adapt to it. There's not much we're going to do about it.
It's Texas.
It's Texas. We have to, we're not going to raise yaks there, We're not going to raise bananas there. We're going to work within that context, and climate is part of that. But we think of it in terms of the biosphere climate. That's the way most people think. But there's also a climate that we work within in terms of our decisions and the way we think. And that's what Lisa, Darren Doherty's wife, she stated before, that the climate of the mind is the hardest to change. Okay, but if we acknowledge it, if we realize it, and begin to see, then we can begin to change that. We can begin to function. We can begin to be out there observing, being in God's creation, functioning within that, feeding the chickens, milking the cow, working in the garden. Over time, that begins to change. And I think what happens with us many times is something changes even within our own heart. And we begin to care for those animals. We begin to care for the land. And that's the key. That's the key for this to become what God intended for it to be, and for your family to be what God intended, is care, the application of care. And so we want to take that application and put it into how we're making our decisions, what we're doing on the land. Care is a critical component. And that's not something that we we certainly decide to do it, but it comes about as we interact. When you think about human relationships, who do we care for the most? Those we interact with the most. Those that we're with. Those that we have responsibility to husband, to shepherd, to take care of. And we're given this responsibility, and we must care for it. And that brings in a whole nother concept that we don't normally think about in terms of agriculture. We think about it in terms of, pottery or woodworking or blacksmithing, and that's craftsmanship. We don't think about agricultural craftsmanship, but that's what we're trying to accomplish. This is what we're trying. We're trying to participate with God in the crafting of a piece of land so that it can provide sustenance for our family.